A few days ago, Brené Brown, well-known professor and podcaster, released the final episodes of her Spotify exclusive podcast as that contract came to an end. And she's not the only one. Several months ago, the Obamas moved to Audible after previously signing a multi-year Spotify exclusive deal to create podcasts. Now, what I thought was interesting about both Brown and the Obamas is that they openly talked about their dissatisfaction with the exclusivity terms of their contracts with Spotify. Brown talked about feeling like she had very few options when there was a clear misalignment of values with some of Spotify's policies, while the Obamas talked about having hoped to negotiate a contract with Spotify where they would reach a broader audience for their podcast and not be exclusive just to the Spotify platform. As an entrepreneur creative watching this video, I know the idea of being contacted by a brand like Spotify for a partnership feels like the golden ticket. It feels like a dream come true. And don't get me wrong, I'm all about securing the bag with these major collaborations. In fact, I feel like it's necessary for the growth of your business and brand. But you have to remember that these big brands are not your savior. You're the one bringing all the creative energy and ideas to the table. And if that brand can't commit to an equitable partnership, then it may not be worth it. Exclusivity terms are just one of 4 terms that you really have to be aware of in podcast distribution and development deals. Hi, I'm Casey, entertainment attorney for Black creatives and entrepreneurs. And in this video, we're going to talk about the 4 terms you have to be aware of when negotiating podcast development and distribution deals. The first one, exclusivity, we've already touched on. When you think about exclusivity, you have to ask yourself questions like, will my talent services only be limited to this platform? Will this podcast be available on other networks, or will it only be exclusive to this platform? Will I be able to participate in other podcasts or audio projects? How broad or expansive is the scope of the exclusivity term? Now, something else you have to be aware of, because oftentimes exclusivity language is pretty clear and straightforward. It'll say throughout the contract whether or not something is exclusive. But you have to be aware of non-exclusive language that has limiting effects. An example of this is first look language. Now, first look language in a podcasting distribution agreement could look like verbiage such as podcaster services shall be rendered on a non-exclusive basis, but company has the right of first negotiation. If you see language like this in your contract, this is indicating that you're signing a first look deal. Now, if you're not familiar with what a first look deal is, which is a very common type of agreement in the entertainment industry, and in fact, the type of contract that the Obamas originally signed with Spotify was a first look deal. This type of contract is essentially where the person who benefits from this clause has an opportunity to take first action on any new opportunities that are presented. Now, if you're the person who's benefiting from this clause, it can be absolutely amazing and wonderful for you. It gives you an opportunity to learn about new big opportunities that you can jump on first. But if you're on the receiving side, then this clause isn't the best thing. And oftentimes in these podcast distribution and development deals with major corporations, you're not going to be the beneficiary of that clause. So an example of this, several years ago, I was negotiating for a client a new opportunity, or we had hoped to negotiate some new opportunities. This client had previously signed a contract with a company that had first look language. And so when new opportunities presented themselves, unfortunately, we weren't able to move forward with some of these other companies who were now interested in my client, interested in the things that she had been doing with her brand and that she had built up, because they found out that there was first look language in her contract. And so immediately they said, we don't even want to present an offer. We don't want to start a negotiating bidding war with this other major company. So this kind of language can have some extreme limiting effects, and you do want to be aware of this because it's very common language that is included in these types of agreements. Number 2, who will own the podcast? As a podcaster, you may want to really fight for your rights to own a podcast, but it's not uncommon for the company that you're signing with to want to have ownership of the podcast. And how they'll do this would be through a work for hire provision. So under the law, anyone who creates the work is automatically going to be the owner of the copyright, unless they give that right away, unless they grant it to another third party. And a common way to grant this right to a third party is through work for hire provisions. So again, the work for hire provision, instead of the copyright being owned by the creator or the podcaster, it's now going to be owned by the company who has essentially commissioned your services to develop this podcast, to be talent on this podcast. So that's the second thing that you want to pay attention to. Who actually owns the podcast and the content that's created from the podcast, because that's going to impact how you can maneuver going forward and what opportunities you can pursue with any content that is derived from the podcast. And that brings me to number 3. Who's going to own the derivative works to the podcast, and what will that revenue share be? So derivative works are works that are based on an already existing work. It's technically its own new piece of intellectual property. It's its own new creative work, but it's based on the original. So an example of this in this particular scenario, say someone wanted to write a book about your podcast, or maybe they want to develop a television series based off of your podcast, or a video series based off of your podcast. That is considered a derivative work. So you want to know who's going to own this derivative work and how will I get paid from it? If the company is the one owning the work, so say you've signed a podcast distribution deal where the company now owns the podcast, do they also own the derivative works? And if so, will you even be able to get a share or a cut in that? And you have to really be aware of this language because it's not always cut and dry. Oftentimes it's not cut and dry. You may see the term derivative work in your contract, but how it is written and worded is not going to always be clear on who owns what and how the revenue is going to be shared. Now, this is another client I worked with more recently, had this exact situation come up where she actually already had an existing podcast that, had a pretty large following, and she signed a podcast distribution deal with a company to reach a broader audience and to grow her brand. And for all intents and purposes, it was a good contract, it was a good relationship, but she had already been in talks with another company about a potential video series based off of her podcast, her existing podcast. And so there was a lot of back and forth in negotiations talking about, who's going to own that potential video series, because she had previously started negotiations with the new company she's signing this podcast deal with. Would they have an opportunity to participate in the revenue share for that? And if so, what's that going to look like? So we had to get very fine in the details about what that looks like to make sure that everyone was happy when we entered into the agreement. Now, something else I want to touch on here is not considered a derivative work, but it's something really common that comes up in these types of contracts, and that's merchandise. So merchandise is a big area where if you want to develop merchandise for your podcast, again, how is the revenue share going to go for that? Who's going to own it? Are there approval rights that are going to come into play? These are all things you need to be aware of. So same client I was just talking about, this was something that came up way after the contract was signed. She wanted to create some merchandise, and after going back through the contract, it became clear that she had to get approval from the company first, and that there were we were able to kind of maneuver around the revenue share there for them because she already had an existing brand. But it's one of those things, again, that you have to be clear and aware of. If you decide to do something like merchandise, are you going to have to share in that revenue with the company? And are you going to have to get approval rights and other things in place before you can move forward? Now, the fourth and final thing that I want to talk about in this particular video are distribution terms. So like exclusivity, you want to be really clear on how long this term is going to last. Will it be several years after the podcast is no longer even being produced? If so, will you or the company continue to receive any revenues from the distribution of the podcast. And the reason you want to spend some time with distribution terms is because this is one that can really have some long-term effects. So your contract may only be, say, a year. Maybe the podcast development and distribution term is just a year for production, but the distribution term may be 5 years. And then maybe some of the other rights in the contracts all stem off of the distribution term. So a contract you entered into thinking that you would only be under these obligations for, say, a year, maybe 2 years max, now has a much longer timeline of 6, 7, plus years. So you want to be very clear on what the distribution terms are going to look like. Now, again, the reason why these long-term effects are so important to be clear on up front is because if for whatever reason you decide you no longer want to work with that company, maybe the relationship has gone sour over time, then you can find yourself in a really tricky situation on how you can get out of that original contract and how you'll be able to move forward with another company for distribution of your podcast. So these are just 4 of the main terms that you want to be aware of in podcast distribution and development contracts. There are many other terms in these types of contracts, as with all contracts, that you should be aware of, but these are the 4 big ones that I wanted to shed some light on today. I hope you found this video to be helpful. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can get notified when I release new videos